I think my title was, is there a Chinese word for Rashomon? And what I meant by that, of course, is it starts from the reference to this brilliant 1950 film by Kurosawa Akira, the great Japanese director. An amazing film. If you haven't seen it, if you're not into the great classic Japanese movies of the 50s, this was really probably the first of the genre, and you really ought to see it. It's just a magnificent movie. But it's a movie that led to essentially to a term in American language, the Rashomon phenomenon, because it's about the plurality of truth. There's a terrible event, and these people are all sitting around in a rainstorm under the ruined gate at the gates of Kyoto, at the Rashomon, the Rasho gate, talking about what happened, and each of the four characters renders what happened in a different way, and you wind up not knowing really quite where truth lies and who really knows what he's talking about. So that struck me as an appropriate metaphor for talking a little bit about United States-China relations. You will find, if you knew me better, that I very seldom am able to say, this is black and this is white, or this is the truth, and it's very clear and simple. I tend not to see the world that way, and I certainly don't see U.S.-China relations that way, and I'm afraid that my talk today is going to illustrate that. Here is a German poster just showing an advertisement from a play drawn from Rashomon, and you can see at the top, 1 dead body, 2 witnesses, 3 accounts, 4 versions. That's sort of what I want to get into during my talk today. Now, to change the subject a little, I first went to China in 1977, January of 77. It was right after the Cultural Revolution, just a couple of months. And I was on the faculty at the University of Washington, and about 15 of us went off to China, and it was just a formative experience. Anybody from the United States who goes to China for the first time has experiences that he or she never forgets. That goes without saying, then, now. But this was, I was a 33-year-old assistant professor, and this was really hot stuff. But what was most interesting was that I learned a real lesson. We would walk down the street, and the civil engineering professor would say, see that building over there? I'm not hooked up, am I? No. See that building over there? Why? When they mixed the mortar to put the stones in place, they added too much blah, 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 and the formula wasn't right. So he was looking at the buildings and discussing the construction methods. And the MD, the doctor, would walk down the street and he'd say, see that guy across the street? He's got a case of shama, shama, shama. And he would recognize the signs of a vitamin deficiency or an eye disease or something like that. And the Soviet specialist would say, this is just like Moscow. You see, the secret police are hiding behind it. And each person went to China and saw what he or she was able to see by virtue of his training. And for me, I mean, this was right at the end of the Cultural Revolution, and the posters denouncing the Gang of Four were still up. It's no longer there, but some of you will remember that in Shanghai, at the foot of Nanjing Road, right on the Waitan, they used to have a big poster board, a big, enormous sort of a rectangular structure. And at the time that we were there, it was right at the end of the Cultural Revolution, right afterward, they still had these very graphic posters blasting the Gang of Four. The city was gray and dark, as you may remember if you've read about it. China in those days was very, very bleak. It was January anyway. There was very little electricity. There was very little color in the city. But the anti-Gang of Four posters were just brilliant and graphic, just fantastic, vibrant things. So the purpose of showing these is just to illustrate point number 1, which is when we view China, we see what we're equipped to see by virtue of our own special backgrounds. If you grew up in Montana on a cattle ranch, you're going to see China in a different way than if you grew up in the Lower East Side or whatever. And it contributes to that plurality with which Americans and the country as a whole perceives and understands China, and I would say the same thing in reverse. This is my favorite. Unfortunately, I didn't position it right in the PowerPoints. But this, of course, is Jiangqing. Isn't that cool? Oh, they were just amazing. They were just extraordinary. So that's point number 1. We get into this sort of Rashomon thing by saying that as a country and as individuals in our professions and our communities, we see China in a different way. And I would venture to say, though I try not to put words into Chinese mouths, that there is some of that on the Chinese side. Now, I want to we're going to run through some books here some of my favorites, because each of them, I think, gives me a chance to talk about the next thing I want to get into, and that is that the American perception of China has enduring and ongoing themes in it. We all know that, as you would expect. I mean, the United States has a continuous history despite its changes. But at the same time, in, I think, very recent years, the American approach to China has changed significantly from what it was until very recently. And these book titles are going to give me a chance to expatiate on that. The Call is a book by the mid-20th century, mid to late 20th century American novelist John Hersey. He also wrote Hiroshima, he wrote The Wall. He was a very popular and really quite a good writer in the 50s, 60s in the United States. This book, he was a missionary kid. His parents were missionaries in China. And he wrote this marvelous, marvelous book about a young man from upstate New York who flunks out of Syracuse University and doesn't know what to do with himself in 1902. And a friend of his says, "Come on with me, we're going to a lecture tonight." And he takes this kind of aimless young guy off to a lecture by a missionary returned from China. And the guy, this young boy, hears the call. And he joins the YMCA, and he heads to China in 1902 or 3 as a YMCA missionary. And the book covers the whole next 50 years, his whole life in China. It is very historically accurate. I know the young woman who was a student at Yale at the time who did John Hersey's history research for him on the book. It's a great read. But the reason I put it on the screen here is that one of the long enduring themes in the sort of center of the American approach to China for a very long time, from the 1830s really until quite recently, was the theme that the United States would be China's teacher, and that China needed what the United States could bring. That had a very strong religious element to it because the Protestant missionary movement in China was not entirely American. There was a great British movement as well. And there was also a Roman Catholic missionary movement in China. But the American Protestant mission in China from the 1830s and 40s all the way to 1950 or so was a very important strand in the American perception of China and the American approach to China. And the book is an illustration of the fact that for that long period, really until, I think, the last 10 years or so, there was a very deep-seated assumption in the United States that the United States would be China's guide, benevolent guide, and that China would be essentially an American student when it came to learning about democracy, learning about modernity, learning about a lot of things. This book, I really recommend it to you. It's a wonderful book. So the book is there to illustrate one of the themes that has persisted, but that, as I'm about to say, has changed a lot in recent years. A second book along somewhat similar lines is a classic. If you've ever taken a Chinese history course at an American university, a modern Chinese history course, I'm sure you've run across it. This was the second book, the sort of throwaway book by Jonathan Spence when he was a young Yale professor. His first book was his PhD dissertation in Qing history, but this was the quickie that he dashed off on the way to becoming a permanent member of the Yale faculty. It's a great book. It's about 10 or 12 Westerners who went to China determined to change China, and the theme of the book is that basically China absorbed each of them, took what it needed from each of them, and then spat them out. And basically each of them was left at the end of a long life with a sense of having been sort of sucked dry, but not really having made that much of a difference to China after all. It's a great read, but it sort of speaks to the same point. In the American engagement with China for a very long time, there was this fundamental assumption that the United States' engagement with China and individual Americans' engagement was defined by a process of changing China. And it was understandable. I mean, China in the 19th and early 20th centuries was in very bad shape, and we don't have to go through our Chinese history now. But, you know, there was the Taiping Rebellion that killed 40 million people, and there was all the foreign invasions, et cetera, et cetera. So, and there was famine, and there was epidemic, and, you know, China was in terrible shape. So it's not a mystery as to why some Americans felt this way, but these themes were part of the American underlying assumptions about how we engage with China. This is probably the most obscure book I've ever loved, published by a very obscure Ohio State University professor in 1972, The Heathen Chinese. Don't get upset about the title. The Heathen Chinese is the name of a poem by Bret Harte, the American poet, and it's actually it's a poem about the mistreatment of Chinese by white mobs in San Francisco or someplace in the 19th century. It is very sympathetic to the Chinese character involved, but it's just a terrific book. I'm sure he didn't know Chinese. It's a book about American attitudes toward China between 1890 and 1905. And it covers all different strata of American life. I mean, Boston Brahmins and elegant, highly educated, what passed for American aristocracy in New York and in New England, but also angry Irish workers in San Francisco in the Knights of Labor, who saw Chinese cheap labor as a threat to civilization, and of course political opportunists in Congress and so forth and so on. I mean, I could have taken 20 quotes from this and spent the rest of the day just reading you quotes from this wonderful book. It's another element of a description of the sort of, in this case, the sort of middle stage, chronologically speaking, in the formation of some very deep-seated American rhetorical perceptions of China, rhetorical devices for thinking about China and speaking about China that have lasted for a long time, but as I'm going to say in a minute, I think have changed a lot in recent, not completely, but a lot in recent years. And so again, if you have a chance, I'm sure USC's got a copy. If you have a chance to see it, you really ought to go look at this wonderful, wonderful book. Now, why did I put Mark Elvin's The Pattern of the Chinese Past up here? Because when I was a graduate student back in about 1818, the subject was why China failed to modernize. I mean, that's what you were raised on. If you went to graduate school in the 60s, and you know, Stan will remember this, the topic was, why didn't China X, Y, Z? You know, the West had a renaissance, the West had an industrial revolution, the West had this, the West had that. China didn't have any of that. It fell into disrepair and internal dissolution and blah, blah, blah. Why didn't it? And Elvin's book, which is, again, a fascinating book, had an argument for why that happened, and the core of his argument was that in the Ming Dynasty, China was so advanced that it fell into what was called a high-level equilibrium trap. It didn't need to innovate. It didn't need to create new ways of doing things because the ways it had were so successful and provided for such a high level of well-being for the population that kind of urge to solve pressing problems didn't arise. Whether that's true or not, the point is that in that period, in the post-war period, the period when I was in school, we didn't have diplomatic relations with China yet. China was a kind of a distant and hostile abstraction. The Western academic profession spent a lot of time talking about what happened to China and why it couldn't modernize. One of the answers, of course, was Confucianism. Confucianism disparaged wealth. The merchant was the lowest of the four social categories. Confucianism looked to the past, to the golden age. There was no sense of progress. There was no sense of blah, 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 blah. You know, today we read that, in fact, Confucianism is the reason why China is so modern and so successful, because Confucians cherish learning. They believe, you know, go figure. But the point was, when we were reading Mark Elvin in graduate school and going through that whole process, the whole perception as Americans becoming China specialists was a completely different perception. Again, understandably so. The Cultural Revolution was going on. I mean, China had gone through political campaigns and Great Leap Forward and so forth. And there were lots of reasons to feel that China was still pretty much unable to get its act together. But whatever the reasons, that was sort of another one of these defining themes in the American perception of China. Here's Two Kinds of Time, my absolutely all-time favorite book on China ever, 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 written by a man who was in China, in KMT, unoccupied China, during World War II. It's his personal account of his years there. And I'll return to Peck with a few quotes before I close. But a book which was written in 1950, just as the McCarthy movement was breaking out in the United States with China as the central question. McCarthy said, who lost China? China had fallen to the communists. The Soviets had detonated their first atom bomb 6 months before. America was in panic, and McCarthy said, who lost China? And it turned out it was, in McCarthy's view, treasonous Americans beholden to Moscow who had given China, essentially handed China to the Chinese communists. And it was a great political convulsion in the United States. But his observations on the way in which China and the United States encountered each other once we were wartime allies after Pearl Harbor, and his observations about what China was like under the nationalists and in this period are an important contribution, I think, to an understanding of how, of what has changed and what hasn't changed, both in China today and in American perceptions of China, and in some ways Chinese perceptions of America. Now, I move a little further here. Some of you know that, incidentally, I gather Los Angeles has a Ripley's Believe It or Not museum. I just learned that reading about Los Angeles on the way down here. I'd love to go to that. I would really like to see that. But I remember this particular Ripley's Believe It or Not from my childhood. If you put all the Chinese, the marching Chinese, if you put all the Chinese together four abreast, the line would never end. I mean, I took that in. I was 8 years old. I saw it in some newspaper. That, you know, and the reason I put this one up is that another element in the long-standing American perception about China, which undergirded a lot of our political and other engagements with China, was revolved around notions of, quote, sheer numbers, unquote. The idea that China represented something kind of mythic in its proportions, of which this is the most egregious kind of popularizing example. But the idea that China represented a kind of a limitless mass of humanity, a kind of a pullulating, roiling mass of humanity, one step removed from the famous blue ants metaphor of the 1950s, when people looked at China under the communists and the people of China were all wearing blue cotton and talked about blue ants. That is another element that I think undergirded a long-standing American perception of China, a perception which I think is now changing a lot. Now, these next couple of pictures also go back to my first trip to China, and I threw them in partly because I just like the pictures. I like to look at them. But this was China in January, this was Beijing in January 77. The Tangshan earthquake had taken place 3 months before. Beijing had been shaken. Tangshan, 250,000 people died in Tangshan, around Tangshan, which is, 75 miles or so from Beijing, maybe a little longer, but close to Beijing. In Beijing, many people were still living in shelters put up on the street. The buildings were unsafe, or they were afraid to go back in their buildings, and a lot of people were living on the street. And this was a sort of city street in Beijing. Now, even in the quietest neighborhoods of Beijing, it doesn't look like this today. I mean, it's just, and this was Wang Fujing and Chang'an. That is the busiest corner in Beijing in January of 1977. There's one Shanghai Che here. You remember the old Shanghai Che? You can see one now in the Shanghai History Museum underneath the Pearl Tower. If you want to see a Shanghai Che, they have one as a museum piece now in the museum downstairs under the Pearl Tower. And a couple of buses, and the rest bikes. And the reason I put these two screens up here is that I go back and forth in my own mind a lot about whether it matters today to know what China used to be like. Now, if you get out of USC, out of the Marshall School, and Goldman picks you up, or Citibank, somebody, and they say, okay, you've got three choices. You can go to New York, you can go to London, or you can go to Beijing. And you pick Beijing, and you go off to Beijing, never having had a course in Chinese history, and being 27 years old. You will see Beijing on your own terms, and you will be a specialized professional doing your little job, your focused job for your American employer. And it may not matter at all what China was like in 1977. And in fact, for most of the young, smart kids you're working with on the Chinese side, it doesn't matter to them either. So the question is, and this is one of these unanswerables that, I'm afraid, where I said black and white don't go together. The question for Americans, and as we all look at the U.S. China relationship, is, does history, ancient or modern, really matter? Or should we see this relationship in a kind of a completely ahistorical way? You know where I'm coming from, of course. The answer is it does matter, not only because I spent all those years taking a PhD in Chinese history and don't want to waste them, but also because if the kids you're working with in the I can't say Bear Stearns, can I? In the Goldman office on Jinrongjie in Beijing today, if they don't remember, their parents do. And I just find it impossible to believe that nothing, as rapidly as China has changed culturally and intellectually in the matter of a couple of generations since 1992 or since 1978, I don't believe for a minute that the memories of the recent generations have been completely denied to the kids. Even if they think they have, they haven't. So I put these two slides up just by way of saying, you know, lest we forget, this is recent times in China. This is just for fun. This is essentially Richard Nixon saying, "Is it spicy?" You know, Americans always go to China, and I mean, the number of times I've taken groups to China and said, "Look, now listen to me. Put it in your chopsticks. Do not say, what is it? Do not say, is it spicy? Put it in mouth. If you think you like it, chew it. If you don't think you like it, swallow it. If you did like it, say, that was delicious, what was it? If you didn't like it, say, no thank you to the second helping." But anyway, I put in, because this is the same era. This is the era when the U.S. and China finally made that sort of, you know, God and David, or, you know, that contact again. And we started off on the new era. This, I think, is Fang Yi, but I can't remember it. Of course, it was show online. Is it spicy? Yes. Now, one more book, and then I'm gonna move on quickly through some other points. This book is here. Dennis Blasko is a really good guy. To me, well, let me stop and make the point of disjuncture here. I think in the past 10 years, a lot of the stuff that I spent time on here has faded into, for the first time, and to my surprise, has faded into the background. That is, I really think America has turned a corner on a kind of a deep-seated sort of substructure consciousness that our job is to educate China and lead China in the direction of modernity and progress and civilization and George Washington and so forth and so on. I mean, Sun Yat-sen may have been called the George Washington of China by Americans generations ago, but I think America has gotten beyond that because China's gotten beyond it and the relationship has gotten beyond it. That's a big change, and it will be reflected unevenly in our politics and in our diplomacy, and even perhaps in the electoral politics of who holds office in the United States, because I'm sure that depending on who does hold office, some people might have a stronger sense of that old-fashioned, for lack of a better term, missionary impulse with regard to China and other parts of the world than others. But basically, China has come so far that long-standing, deep, fundamental assumption that Americans brought to looking at China and to our engagement even at the government level, I think is pretty much a dead letter now. To my surprise, I thought it would never die, but it really has fed back. Similarly with the idea of looking at China as essentially a failed state. You know, it was hard not to look at China as a failed state for a very long time. America was on an ascending curve and territorially in the midst of or at the conclusion of its own great territorial expansion. And China was in disarray in every sense. And there are reasons for having looked at China as a failed state. And some people still do, and I, for one, feel that China faces huge pitfalls that could do it grievous harm in terms of its future integrity. But right now, you're going to have to scratch very hard before you find an American who looks at China, it seems to me, as wreckage, and looks at China as something to be acted upon by the United States or by the powers. It's just not the case, and that's largely due to China's own achievements. In that regard, therefore, as we look at a different view of China and a different relationship with China, I could talk at length about trade and business and what American companies think and so forth, but I wanted to get to the central point here, that in the American approach to China now, in my view, the national security discourse has the capability of trumping everything else. That is to say, under the wrong circumstances, if things went in a particularly bad way and China became understood by the United States, and especially by the people as a whole, primarily in terms of existential threats to the what Americans used to call the American way of life, or to American national security. The national security dimensions of this complex relationship with China have the power to trump almost every other discussion. Now, the security dialogue, again, we could spend the rest of the day on it. It's a very interesting and complicated one. My major concern in the discussion of national security issues with China is a structural problem, and that is that you, to a large degree, in spite of all the work that's done by American scholars in academia and the think tanks, based on disciplines, international relations disciplines and so forth, there's still a divide between those who are in the security community and those who are not. And if you are not credentialed inside the security community, which means, among other things, clearances and a kind of a membership in that fraternity or sorority of people who do American national security for a living, full time, often with considerable access to classified materials, you don't have standing. You don't have the necessary standing to really make a decisive difference in the conduct of American security policy, in my view. Occasionally a Samuel Huntington comes along and so forth, but that kind of membership inside or not inside the community is a structural issue. You can't give clearances to everybody, but the people who have the clearances can always say, you know, if you knew what I knew, but I can't tell you what I know, you would see it my way. And I felt this very strongly with the business community. It was just fascinating trying to get the business community and the security community together to talk. And on both sides, it was a problem. A lot of the business people basically would go to a couple of meetings and say, I don't have time for this. This is not what I do. I want to sell deodorant, or I want to make cars. And they would drift away. And at the same time, the security people were saying, guys, you're just, you know, you don't know anything. Take it from me, I know, because I've got the clearances. You don't know anything. So you really don't have much to talk about here. So a major concern of mine, now that the perception of China has changed so much, lies in the realm of the future of the security dialogue within this country and between the two countries. Now, oh yes, these two slides go together, and they represent another aspect of what I think is a not entirely eliminated theme in American engagements with China, American perceptions of China. We were sitting around in Washington, D.C. leading our lives, and suddenly it turned out that the Chinese snakehead fish had been found in a pond in Maryland. And it turned out that someone had imported to a fish store a snakehead fish, and a customer had bought it and tossed a couple of them into the pond. Well, the Chinese snakehead fish had eaten up every living creature in the pond. And the question, it's like the one in Chicago that they're trying to keep from going through the locks into Lake Michigan. There's some predator fish. The Chinese snakehead fish was going to eliminate all life as we know it in the Potomac River and all the rivers of the eastern United States and so forth and so on. Well, I was reminded of I find the notion that this is the Chinese snakehead fish amusing but also troubling. I kept for many years a file called the China Tide Syndrome. And the China Tide Syndrome was full of stories, often from newspapers or from the media, about noxious emanations from China. Naked migrants washing up on the Malibu beach in the middle of a beach party at 2 in the morning. Borers that came in, little borers that came in cargo pallets and were going to destroy the forests of the eastern United States. Asia, and then flu viruses and so forth and so on. I became hypersensitive, especially in the politically charged climate of Washington in those years, to the periodic eruptions of a sense that China was a kind of a fountainhead of noxious emanations that were spreading out over the world and threatened to invade the United States. And even in the poison toys, poison drugs, poison toothpaste explosions of a couple of years ago, I had a little bit of a sense of that when it really got going in the media and the crazy websites, and certainly in some of the political statements that were made. You had the feeling that old sort of bugaboo, that old sort of underlying perception of this kind of nameless menace was rising up to the surface again. I don't believe for a minute that I think it's great that lead-painted toys were coming into the United States to be eaten by, to be swallowed by American kids. That's not the point. The point is that this again is one of these themes. And this one I'm a little less certain about having gone completely underground, because in fact the problems are still there. I mean, there's still melamine in the milk over and over again. There's still pork that lights up in the dark. We can read about it all the time, and it makes great media fodder. But nevertheless, in the American perception of China, this notion that China is this sort of origin point for bad sort of vapors and things, it was exemplified by the big furor over the Chinese snakehead fish. Now, in the reports of the Imperial Maritime Customs Post from Chongqing in 1890, which was about as dull a place to be as you could be if you were the Britisher, the one Britisher in Chongqing in the treaty port, writing the decennial report of about what's going on in the Chongqing customs district. You see a little bit of the same thing. I mean, well, nothing's happened here for the last 10 years. 3 years ago, one English woman was bitten by a native puppy. Now, I just thought that was the funniest thing I ever saw. The whole idea that the mongrel dog that bit the English lady was a native puppy. Again, this is a colonial Brit kind of a person. A native puppy, it's a little like the Chinese snakehead, and I always found things like that amusing but again, the snakehead made its way even into the humor columns. The Dow was down 170 points. Hey, isn't that one of those Chinese snakefish? How did it get inside our cartoon? So that's another theme which I think is not entirely extirpated, and one which we have to be vigilant about. Now, I'm not spending a lot of time on how the Chinese view the Americans, and there are a lot of bad things, and you see it in the websites and the blogs and so forth and so on. And some of these are mirror images of each other in terms of the sort of idea, I mean, the whole notion of sort of bad influences from America coming in and polluting our China and our Chineseness and so forth. That goes way, 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 way back in China to the 19th century. And you see recrudescences of it even now. Now, I'm about to end the slides. And here is a picture of a great university, which you may know. And here is a picture of a book that I picked up in China last summer, a modern day version of the three-character classic and the rules for kids. These are two of the ancient formative kindergarten or earlier little kind of mnemonic device kind of books that teach kids basic norms and values and behavioral rules in China. Why are USC and the Sanzijing on the screen here together? Well, for a couple of reasons. As we look at the relationship between the United States and China, it's important to realize, and I say this as one who has taught for many years, that metaphorically speaking, freshmen are always 17 and you always have to start with Confucius. Which is to say that, if you teach introductory Chinese history, I mean, there's certain things you've always got to start with. And obviously some people go to college at the age of 30 and some people go to college at the age of 50, but by and large, freshmen are 18 or 19 years old or 17, and you got to start over. And it is important as we look at the U.S. relationship with China to recognize, well, just look at Congress. Look at Congress. I mean, there are 87, I don't know how many new Democrats there are, probably not more than 3 or 4. But in the last election, 87 new Republicans came to China. Was any one of them elected on his or her international skills? Duh, no, into the House. And so you realize that in this evolving relationship between the United States and China, even as the relationship has become so huge and so diverse, involving every segment of American society, not every segment, but vast swaths of American society now, regionally diverse, professionally diverse, in so many ways, so many Americans from different kinds of lives are engaged with China in one way or another now, vastly more than in the past, when it was the missionaries and the government and the merchants, and that was about the size of it. Even so, freshmen are always 17, and you always have to be starting over. Now, this is not to demean USC. USC does a lot more than teach freshmen, but it is to say that educating about China has to be constantly pursued and reinvented and reiterated. I mean, Stan Rosen's been teaching for 30 or 40 years, and we know, whatever the numbers stand, I hope 30 anyway. Who counts Mrs. Cohen? 32, all right, fine. But the point is, it is, we all need to remember that just as people of a certain age can look back and remember what China used to be 35 years ago, there are constantly flows of people into the U.S. China relationship now who start at zero. And I feel very strongly that universities, all universities, but especially really good ones, have a very, very important role to play in that regard. So whether we start teaching American kids the three-character classic in translation or not, I don't know. But that job is an important element in the evolving U.S.-China relationship that universities must not ignore. I was thrilled to take a group of American college instructors to China last summer under a Fulbright program from schools that had very little in the curriculum, and most of the schools had nothing in the curriculum. And the idea was to try to help instructors get some sense of something about China that they could help turn into the beginnings of a couple of days teaching in their courses, or some readings and so forth. They were novices to it. It was fascinating, and I think very meaningful. Several of them, I think, really had their academic trajectories changed by that exposure, and will continue to deepen it in that way. At schools that you and I have probably, most of us, never heard of. It was wonderful. So we've all got a role to play, but big and good schools like USC even more. And finally, of course, just to bring this home to Los Angeles, I thought I would conclude by saying the United States and China have many problems today, one of which is the theft of intellectual property, and this one in particular strikes me as very, very germane to life in the greater Los Angeles area. I hope you'll all think very hard about this, and there'll be an hour exam on it tomorrow at 4 in the afternoon. Now, this is not the end of the talk. Few final points, just me. In this complex relationship, which is so huge now and involves so many different dimensions, governmental and otherwise, and certainly business, there are some things that I have, over a long period of time, developed some real concerns about. China, compared to 25 years ago, China is an open book. You can go over there, you can talk to people on the street, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly politically, information is restricted and controlled, and there are a lot of things which are pretty much off. For one thing, it's an East Asian society to begin with, so the kind of let it all hang out, open-hearted psychology that Americans sometimes bring to new acquaintances is not usually the case in any East Asian society. And second of all, there are restraints on information and communication that are just part of the fabric there. Americans, I remember on one of my early trips to China, riding in the elevator in the Beijing hotel with a gushing woman from New York who was saying to her Chinese guide, whom she had probably met 18 minutes before, something like, "Oh, it's so wonderful to be here and to make friends across the sea. Let me tell you about my daughter's incest recovery program," or something like that. I mean, something so incredibly internal that this Chinese lady was looking at this American thinking, is this woman out of her mind? And the American thought, hands across the sea means instant psychological openness, the most intimate things shared. It was pretty funny. But since that's not realistic, I have become very sensitive to a tendency that I think we all need to avoid at the government level, in other words, and otherwise, and that is attributing motivations and psychic states to the Chinese people we're engaged with, or those whom we are observing as scholars or journalists, when we really don't know what those motivations and psychologies are. I mean, I belong to a listserv with a lot of China specialists, and we go back and forth all the time. And I get very concerned when somebody makes a flat-out, bald statement about what people are thinking in the Politburo. We don't know what they're thinking in the Politburo, and it's a dangerous and risky. I mean, the impulse is understandable. We want to know what they're thinking because we want to know how the Chinese government is behaving and why and what it will do. But the risk of that is that if you say this just goes to show that they're terrified of, that Kim Il-sung will launch his divisions across the border into China or something, and you don't know it, you can go off on a set of assumptions that are generated entirely within your imagination and really make mistakes. So in this complicated, multifaceted relationship, attributing motives and psychological states to the other side, I think, is a great concern of mine. Related to that is the vexing problem of how do we know what they're really saying and how do they know what we're really saying? Because obviously in the kind of relationship that the United States and China have now, much more engaged than ever before, really in history, very intense. Dozens of bureaucratic agencies within the government, every university in the country, thousands of companies and so forth. The process of communicating between the two sides, and I find this personally fascinating, stimulating, but vexing, involves complex operations at many levels at the same time. Take, for example, the Congress. I mean, it's hard not to get a little cynical when you sit around in Washington, D.C. Foreigners don't vote. You know, basically for a very long time, China was a free trip to the plate. You could whack China, and, or, you know, what are they going to do about it? They don't vote. And you go to a press conference with the visiting secretary of this or that in Beijing, or even the president, and you sit there in the press conference, and the Chinese reporters are asking questions, but the American official is speaking to the camera for the audience in Cleveland, or the audience in San Diego. And so as the two countries engage diplomatically, or even two companies sitting down together to try to work out their deals, the awareness that audiences are multiple, that agendas are multiple, and that certainly many of those agendas are not visible, is a great, huge challenge. Again, I told you at the beginning there wasn't going to be a clear answer to this, but I think we can't just say, who cares, I'm not going to conduct myself that way. The process of trying to understand what operates in the behavior of our counterparts on the Chinese side, and I'm sure they feel the same way about us, although I think in a way America is a more open book than China in this regard, both for political reasons and for cultural reasons, is a process that we can't ignore, and one which I think in terms of the work of the U.S. China Institute, for example, could yield some very, very interesting, if somewhat open-ended forms of research and thinking in the future. Then there's the question, does public opinion matter? I think it does, and related to that, I think people-to-people engagements with China are very, very important. This really is a much bigger relationship now than the two governments meeting at the Strategic and Economic Dialogue in Washington, or meeting when the ambassador goes in to meet the foreign minister and so forth and so on. And the question, does public opinion matter? Yes, it does. It matters in this country, and it matters in China for somewhat different reasons. Susan Shirk, who is down the street at the University of California, San Diego, wrote a book which was widely read. The Chinese have not been terribly fond of it, called China Fragile Superpower, in which she argued that thanks to the growth of the internet, thanks to the semi-liberation of the media, thanks to a lot of things that have happened socially in China in the last 15 years, the Chinese government itself operates under pressures of public opinion now that it didn't used to have to care about at all. It's not just a question of the Chinese government manipulating public opinion by controlling the sources of information. It's a kind of a feedback situation now in which they have to be on their good behavior, not to be seen as giving too much away to the Americans, being too polite to, being too patient with American insults or American impositions on China, et cetera, et cetera. And people can debate about whether she's right or not, but some of it is certainly true, and there really is, at least in the internet, public opinion in China in ways that are not entirely controllable. But in the U.S., it really does matter, and I'm of mixed minds about this. You know, I think, I once said to the number 2 guy in the Chinese embassy, U.S. China relations are going to survive. It was right in the middle of the late 90s. In the late 90s, we had, some of you will remember, campaign finance. Clinton won a second term. The Republicans charged that Chinese influence and even money had been put into the Clinton campaign. Then it turned out that one of Clinton's big campaign supporters, somebody who I think is probably California-based, Bernie Schwartz of Loral, that's a California company, right? Bernie Schwartz, big Clinton supporter, head of Loral, how did it work? Had built a satellite with Hughes that was to be launched for a Chinese customer on a Chinese rocket and the satellite, the rocket failed from the Xichang launching pad. The rocket failed, the rocket came down. Hughes and Laurel sent over a team to investigate the causes of the fizzle, and secrets were given to the Chinese by Hughes and Laurel, which actually could be used by the Chinese for improvement of their intercontinental ballistic delivery systems. And Schwartz was a big Democratic fundraiser. Then came the Los Alamos nuclear secrets furor, really big furor, the stealing of the W-88 warhead secrets, all of which was traced back, it was said, and given to China, all of which was traced back to ostensibly to a Chinese, a scientist at Los Alamos of Chinese ethnic origin and so forth. And then finally there was the Cox Commission led by a member of the Southern California congressional delegation, which came out with a huge apocalyptic report. And it really was a furor. I mean, the American public anxiety about this through the media was really, really intense. And yet, in the 2000 election, which came sort of at the conclusion of this 3 or 4 years of constant excitement. In the meantime, we bombed the embassy in Belgrade. I mean, it was just mayhem. It was just anarchy in the U.S. China relationship. And a lot of people were very upset. In the 2000 election, I think the only person who might have gotten into office with any reference to China at all was Senator Stabenow of Michigan, who's screaming about China may have made some difference. For the rest, and also, by the spring of 2000, we had the colossal political battle over granting 最惠国待遇, 永久最惠国待遇 to the Chinese, permanent MFN, permanent normal trade relations to the Chinese, one of the conditions that permitted and facilitated China's entry into the WTO and made possible the American gaining of all the benefits that China had agreed to as a condition of getting into the WTO. So there was that gigantic battle, which was my sort of moment of highest energy in my years in Washington. And after all of that, in the 2000 election, China wasn't even mentioned. Nobody got in or got kicked out. You know, the opponents of permanent normal trade went around saying, if you vote for PNTR, you're dead meat this November. You will not survive. We will throw you away. It didn't happen, zero. So I said to this minister of the embassy, you know, U.S.-China relations are going to survive because, this was 2000, remember, not now, because, and some of you who are Chinese are going to at first be, I think, shocked by what I say and maybe even offended. Because the U.S. is too important to China and China is too unimportant to the United States. Now, why would I say something so shocking? This man looked at me as though I was completely out of my mind. And what I said, I knew I'd shock him. What I went on to say was, look, my perception was you can light a fire about China in the United States, but you can't really keep it burning. You can have a flare-up. You can have something that galvanizes, like poison toys, you know, things that endanger our kids, pet food, we all love our dogs, something that just gets everybody really up in arms. But you can't keep a permanent state of animosity and hostility toward China going in the United States. Why? This was the year 2000 after all. Because it's just too far away. I mean, I once got on an airplane with Secretary Rubin, whom I knew, and I said, you're going out to the APEC meetings in Jakarta? And he said, well, yeah, but you know, it's so goddamn far. I thought, you're the Secretary of the Treasury, and you're telling me that Jakarta's too far? I mean, hello, this is the modern world. But that sense that China was sort of over the horizon for a long time really meant that, you know, you couldn't really, the American people, said I to the minister of the embassy, are not going to commit the American national patrimony in an endless existential struggle with China in the year 2000 the way they did in 1946 and 1947 with the Soviet Union. It's just, it's not going to happen. That's why they're going to survive. Now, that was 11 years ago, and I'll stop on this. I basically think that's still true, but I have to admit that China is a much bigger part of the American consciousness now than it was in the year 2000. And not in all bad ways, but the reality of Chinese power and the reality of how much the Chinese people have achieved and how well the Chinese people have improved their lives And the strength that China exerts in the global economy is really different than it was in the year 2000 and has, I think, probably forever changed and in a way compromised some of the message that I was giving to this man 11 years ago. It's not that we're bound for destruction now. It's not. I don't believe that for a minute. It is to say that the American people now, China is not too far away anymore. It really is not. For one thing, everybody knows you can get on a plane and go. But beyond that, China is a part of our lives. And it's not just Walmart. I mean, it's just everywhere you look. And to some extent, I think, not perhaps even as much. We are in China as well. So these are musings. They're not an answer to a clear definition of U.S. China relations today. And there's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about. But they're musings on a very complex relationship which requires feeding and caring for, and in which the Chinese sometimes do and sometimes do not play constructive roles. There are vast issues on which Americans take legitimate issue with China, whether it be on the trade side or the human rights side or many other things. I have fairly clear-eyed views of China, and they are not the views of a panda hugger, as people used to accuse me of being. But I think if we're good at our jobs and we recognize the need for nuance and for linguistic subtlety and for balance in our approaches to China as individuals and as a country, and the Chinese hopefully do the same with us, there's a lot we can do together and a lot we must do together. Thank you very much.